Last year on this occasion, yeah, last year on this occasion, very honest, so speechless. So I was given the very difficult task of finding an equally speaker. So, Elizabeth Hobson, welcome.
Thank you. I'm still waiting for my OBE, but I'm sure it's in the post.
Yeah.
Me, mine as well. Yeah. So I've got like 20 minutes of a speech to deliver. I did ask Rex to let everyone know that I wanted you to jump in, but actually having realised what I want to say, I think it, might be better for me to just get what I need to say out, and then you can. Yeah, I think we will need some discussion. I do raise an objection to half of one of Parity's objectives. Actually, yeah. So I'll be interested, and I'm a little bit, anxious to hear what you all think about it. But let's go. So, first of all, thank you all for joining me in the divorce capital of the world to discuss post-separation property rights and wrongs. I imagine that an economic approach to answering the problems that I have no doubt people of your calibre are well aware of may either seem dry or gross. Dry because we have, as a civilization, accepted a degraded, perfunctory and narrow concept of economics, lacking in moral imagination. Gross because we all know that the victims of separation who need protection are the children who are denied access to loving parents, and that the loving parents who have to struggle in the hopes of being granted the right to parent their children will willingly expend any and all money that they can in their battles to do so. I believe, though, that economic justice would naturally defend family justice if it mitigates animosity and removes incentive to minimise an other parent's time with children. Raising children requires the taking of responsibility. From our days on the African savannah and way beyond, right up until reliable birth control became readily available, men and women took responsibility for children through a division of labour, all but universally. We are technically past that, but our instinct, in addition to the lobbying of special interest groups, including those who weaponise gynocentrism and those who profit from the tragic mess that we are in, are preventing us from adapting to current conditions. Does anyone want a definition of gynocentrism before I go on? It might be useful for the recording, mightn't it? So gynocentrism is the human tendency to prioritise the well-being, the needs and the preferences of women over men. And it is, I believe, a result of women being the limiting factor in reproduction. So in tribal societies, if women are individually able to, create one child every year at best throughout their childbearing years, which are shorter than men's anyway, one man is capable of siring many, many children. And therefore, if you are dependent on producing children to survive as a tribe, you need to protect your women. Yes. So I do need to make a disclaimer. I'm not necessarily concerned about the divorce rate in terms of total numbers in our society. What I do find troubling is the disparity in the rates of men and women initiating divorce. So the disparity suggests to me that men and women have different, conflicting, systemically granted incentives and or disincentives to pursue divorce. I can't believe that there is such a disparate ratio of unsuitable husbands as compared to wives. I'd probably feel more comfortable if the overall rate remained the same, but with fewer women initiating divorce and more men initiating divorce. The one reason that I'm not worried about the total number of divorces is that I don't think it's unusual. Many hunter-gatherer societies have been and continue to be serially monogamous, just like we are. I was once told by a friend that our modern day divorce rate is proportional to typical rates in hunter-gatherer societies. I've not found conclusive evidence. If anyone can confirm or deny that, I'd be very interested to hear, but the prevailing pattern of serial monogamy is absolutely there. Regarding somewhat more recent history, there's a book by Maria Nicolau called Divorced, Beheaded, Sold, in which the author argues that during the period between 1500 to 1847 precisely, so don't ask me what was happening in 1848, there is substantial evidence that divorce was a constant feature of British society, that there were ways to end marriages and there is often generally tolerated. You know, there is, now we have the legal kind of system as clear as it is, it looks like we have all these legal divorces happening, but with working class people, you know, their marriages weren't necessarily legally sanctioned and they could just move to another place and start a new life, and you wouldn't have that in a figure. You know, there were also ways in which people with money could achieve those ends. I'd argue that the rise in divorce numbers that we have seen since the 1960s is at worst an inevitable side effect of otherwise generally positive development trends, and at best that it actually does provide opportunities for greater human happiness, with people empowered to move on from relationships that are not optimal, with barriers to the best case scenario being the unscrupulous behaviour and unnecessary conflict that our present approach to dividing property post-separation encourages, and the impact that these negative behaviours have on wider family members, including children. And it also happens to be a system that perversely punishes productivity, which is a problem for society at large. In the 21st century UK, sentimental ideas of women's inferior abilities to provide for themselves and men's responsibilities to provide for women are upholding morally repugnant and socially dysfunctional legal standards of property division. There is currently no cap on the amount of capital or value of assets that can be awarded in a divorce settlement. There's no time limit on how long payments to maintain a former spouse in the condition to which they've become accustomed can last. There are no time limits within which former spouses can apply for financial settlements. And that includes if a settlement has been reached in court already. A former spouse can go back to court and say, actually, I need some more money 20 years later and potentially achieve that. And prenuptial agreements are non-binding in the UK. There's a concept of 50-50 splits in marital assets, which are inclusive of any assets accrued by either party during the marriage, but this is typically disregarded anyway when there are children involved, who typically find themselves living with their mother after their parents separate, of course. Evidence from China, however, shows that there's another way. Their 2011 interpretation of their marriage law revolutionized the way in which property is divided there post-separation. Previously, it was actually much akin to UK law is today, but now assets belonging to the like they belong to the purchasing party, or in the case of immovable objects purchased by parents as a gift, for example, they belong to the party in whose name they are registered in. Despite concerns that women would suffer as a result of these changes, after a short dip in women's reported well-being post-separation immediately after the changes took place, the adverse effects for women have weakened because people have adapted to new conditions. Disputes have been minimized, an incentive has been removed for the practice of marrying for money, and God willing, women have been gifted a more noble incentive to become the strong, independent creatures that we're capable of becoming. But it's if and how it helps children that's the real moral question. And I think that's easily answered with another question. Which parental provision is most important for children, money or time? There are people out there who like to paint pictures of non-resident parents as irresponsible. I believe that irresponsible non-resident parents are rare. Human beings have a long evolutionary history of heavy investment in our offspring. We're hardwired to be motivated to prioritize our children's needs for a remarkably extended period as compared to most mammals. All we need to be is free to do so. Right now, perverse incentives encourage some separated parents to deny their ex-partners the opportunity to provide their children with what they really need, which is co-parenting. Perverse economic incentives. It's a collective failure to protect children's interests that allows resident parents to appropriate money and property from non-resident parents in order that resident parents might relinquish responsibility for their children's financial provision. It's also a collective failure to protect collective interests that punishes productive people by forcibly redistributing their wealth to ex-partners. We do run the risk here of discouraging diligence in our population, and that's a virtue that we weaken at our collective peril. Obviously, it's not good enough only to reject child maintenance awards in divorce orders as standard if the state is ready to redistribute the money of taxpayers to fund the lifestyles of single parents by choice. And there are a lot of working class children whose resident parents maintain sole custody, not so that they can stay home while their ex earns and funds their lifestyle necessarily, but in order to maximize their eligibility for welfare benefits. And those children should not be forgotten. The UK was the first state to ratify the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1951, including Article 16.3, which reads, "The family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state." If the state branch could potentially be funding the destruction of families, I believe that we have a legal, never mind moral, obligation to exercise preventative measures. That might involve viewing claims for benefits in more detail, obligating the state to ascertain why it is that one parent has sole custody before awarding benefits on that basis. It might involve the state denying awards on that basis, where it's found that a non-resident parent is willing and able to care for the children involved more so than he or she does, but is being denied the opportunity by a resident parent. I hope it goes without saying here that the family court reform that should never have become necessary, the allegations of unfitness for parenting need to be judged by a standard beyond reasonable doubt rather than the preponderance of evidence or 51% wins out standard that outrageously passes for justice within family courts today needs to happen with urgency. and the same would need to be true wherever the state was to arbitrate the question of whether one parent should be entitled to full benefits on account of being solely able to raise children. The obligation to protect the family might even involve a more generalized reduction in benefits entitlements to make refusal to work less attractive, which would leave some children poorer. Is that a bad thing? It feels bad, right? But in the words of Jiminy Cricket, the right things may seem wrong sometimes, or sometimes the wrong things may be right at the wrong time, or vice versa. I turn now to the work of a highly moral economist, Thomas Sowell. In his empirical research, he has repeatedly found no causal link between transferences of wealth and positive outcomes for the children who are supposedly intended to benefit from these transferences. In fact, he talks rather of a preponderance of negative outcomes when the incentive to develop personal human capital, which is the ability to create wealth, is mitigated. In a 2016 discussion published by the Hoover Institution, which can be viewed on YouTube, he even suggests that the pain of poverty is a useful motivator for individual self-development. Making relative poverty more comfortable, particularly in a society where the poor have smartphones, flat screen TVs, and obesity problems, does not ameliorate relative poverty. It only increases the intransigence of the problem. In Sowell's book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals, he explores Black education, achievements, myths, and tragedies. One relative myth that he debunks in there is the idea that being born into the working class is a death knell for the prospects of success. He highlights the incredible story of Washington, D.C.'s Dunbar High School. Dunbar was known as the DC's one academic high school for Black students. Reflecting on the consistently outstanding academic achievements that the school maintained between the 1890s and the early 1950s, 1970s academics were quick to insist that the students in attendance during that period were middle class. Taking the academic year of 1892 to 1903, for example, of the known occupation of Dunbar's parents, there were 51 labourers, 25 messengers, 12 janitors, and 1 doctor. As late as 1948, 1/3 of all Black youngsters attending high school, were attending Dunbar. If we only took the children of doctors and lawyers, a former Dunbar principal asked, how could we have had 1,400 Black students at one time? Over the entire 85-year history of academic success in this school, which ran from 1870 to 1955, most of its graduates went on to higher education. This was highly unusual for either Black or white high school graduates during that era. At one time, the reputation of graduates from this school who did not test entrance was so great that they did not have to take entrance examinations to be admitted to Dartmouth, Harvard, or other selective universities. Dunbar provided a remarkable foundation for the betterment of students who were lacking in economic privilege in their day, never mind compared to ours, bringing to the US the first Black federal judge, the first Black general, the first Black cabinet member, the first Black senator elected since the Reconstruction, and among many other notables, the doctor who pioneered the use of blood plasma, the historian Carter G. Woodson, author and poet Sterling Brown, and Duke Ellington, who studied music at Dunbar. During World War II, when Black military officers were rare, there were among this school's graduates many captains and lieutenants, nearly a score of majors, 9 colonels and lieutenant colonels, and 1 brigadier general. Dole suggests that Dunbar was not alone, that many schools, entirely or predominantly attended by economically underprivileged students in the US, have nurtured impressive outcomes. He recalls a visit to Albany Avenue School during the 1970s. Inside those classrooms were Black children, much like you can find in any ghetto across the country. Many came from broken homes and were on welfare. Yet inside this school, they spoke in grammatical English in complete sentences and to the point. Many of the materials they were studying were a year or more ahead of their respective grade levels. And the capacity for young people to defy the expectation that the household income they go home to remains. In the chapter that Sowell recounts a long list of modern US schools whose poor students are accomplishing seriously impressive results. Substantial changes to systems as complex as welfare would of course need to be pursued with adaptive cautiousness by societies who are appropriately aware that it's significantly easier to make complex systems worse rather than better. But substantial change, I believe, is in order. Feminist Janet Street Porter, in a 2017 article for The Independent, expressed moral condemnation for the current divorce law excellently when she asked, why should divorce entitle a former wife to an income for life, expecting to be supported long after any children have finished their education seems to be asking for special treatment. Yet most judges, men, seem to think that women need help and should be allowed to live in the manner to which they have become accustomed. Marriage must be treated like a simple contractual agreement where terms of separation, division of property, and financial arrangements in the event of a breakup are included in the legal document that binds one person with another. In Porter's estimation, the status quo that we have come to with regards to property division post-separation is a patronizing load of tosh spouted in the name of chivalry. In my anti-feminist estimation, the misandry and gynocentrism that her feminist sisters and brothers have deliberately weaponized in their quest for control can only have served to encourage most judges, men, to be more sympathetic to the pleas of divorcing wives as opposed to their husbands. Furthermore, the thin gruel of rights, as Jordan Peterson has referred to, that women in particular have been bombarded with by feminists, the opportunities that women have in cases of divorce that we've had no serious feminist pushback against for all their talk of equality, and the liberation of relational feminine aggression that has been championed by feminists can only pervert women's morality, which may be particularly vulnerable as a result of the emotional strains of breaking up. However, I honestly think that it is possible that we will move in the Chinese direction in the UK, and it would not surprise me to see feminists at the barricades, prompted by the growing rate of divorce settlements that disadvantage productive women, the Adele. And if and when that happens, I for one will cheer. Thank you. Please do. Yes, so I mean, presently what we have is that we have quite recently kind of codified, there was an idea of common law marriage, which actually wasn't a legal standard, although people imagined it was. We are kind of codifying that as a legal standard, so we're sort of treated the same. But my position is fairly consistent in that I feel that regardless of the situation within a relationship, or even in broader terms, as far as possible, what someone creates, the wealth that someone creates, should be theirs to dispose of as they will.
Party who has care of children gets the most advantageous. And I think you said earlier on that children prosper best where private jobs are affection.
Yeah.
A child that is brought up in affection is not. Then
yes, there is a sort of idea that has an enormous sort of amount of traction, I think, in our society, that children, you know, innately benefit from having more financial resources available, but the evidence just isn't there for that. The evidence for them prospering where there is real meaningful time spent with them by their parents, that is there. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Indeed. But you refer quite often in your talk to American schools which were producing excellent graduates, despite the fact that the entrants were from
poor. Yeah.
But what do those schools have in common which enable them to do that?
Yeah, so Sowell is quite clear that there is no one size fits all good approach to providing good education, but what his schools do have in common, the ones that he cites, are that there is an emphasis on discipline. Kids turn up on time, and parents are encouraged to parent their children, actually, so that if their children are misbehaving in school, their parents are made aware, and the parents are asked to rein the kids in so that they do behave well. But you know, the US is it's an interesting sort of case study for so many things, because across time within the same state, you can compare different, you know, approaches that have been tried in all different kinds of areas, and you can also compare approaches that are tried at the same time in different states. So it's a very useful place to look when you want to compare kind of the impacts of social programs. Yeah. Yeah.
Wonderful school somewhere who insists on uniform, respect the teachers, all the things that one would insist upon. And the result of that school are absolutely totally outstanding. So it does seem to suggest that where the children do respond, where the atmosphere invokes a responsibility from them.
Yeah.
And
well, yeah, and it's not only not more widely recognized, but we seem to be nationally approaching and even like not just nationally, but civilizationally trying to come at it from a completely different angle, that we want, you know, everyone to just be happy, and we want to build their self-esteem. And you know, you can't meaningfully build someone's self-esteem without actually pushing them to achieve something. That's very unstable if you just tell them they're really just right as they are. I don't know. I mean, that's what
Yeah, but you
Churchill
don't
had.
find, Robert, you're beautiful. John, you and I have
Yeah. Yes, I am. Right, okay, so the disparity is, I haven't checked the very latest statistics, but it's women initiating somewhere between 70 and 80% of divorces. It's big. Yeah. So I mean, well, no, I mean, it's something I've thought about. You know, I think that it is because women feel fairly confident that when they, you know, if or when they are going to a court and pleading their case, they will be looked at favorably. You know, I think there is also a social acceptance of women giving up on relationships, actually, which, you know, in situations where actually it might be a good idea to try to persevere, try to work things out. You know, I mean, if you read women's magazines, which I do try not to, but you know, the sort of, and the feminist literature as well, there's a book by Naomi Wolf called Vagina, and she spends a whole chapter explaining all the things that men need to do if they are to be worthy of women staying with them. She opens the chapter by saying that she has all these friends in New York, all these women that she knows who have left men who are of good character and provided for them and their children. And she asks, why did they leave these men? And the answer is that they were bored. And she then writes, you know, the rest of the chapter is a long list of all the things that men need to do to stop women becoming bored. And they're all very much contradictory. It's like you need to be like stable and make her feel secure, and also be spontaneous, and, you know, take her on these like wild adventures when she wasn't expecting anything, and all of this kind of stuff. And there are literally no prescriptions for what a woman should do to be worthy of a man staying with her. So I think that there is a really toxic kind of disparate expectations on what men should do in order to be worthy of women's love, and what women should do, or just not do anything at all.
Well, no.
Anything.
Looks like you spent a lot of time. Yeah.
100%, yeah. The evidence when you come to very complex social problems is difficult to pull apart. And so, you know, the evidence that I look at that says one thing to me based on the writers that I am reading and the kind of principles that I have will indicate something completely different to someone else. So I don't think, you know, it's not a case of, it's not as simple. I think. Yeah. So it's the parity objective F, that there should be more rigorous enforcement of maintenance orders. It's child contact and maintenance orders. My you know, I absolutely, I mean, the enforcement of child contact orders is an utter national shame. Like, it is a tragedy and it is horrendous. We're talking about a situation wherein court orders, family court orders for non-resident for resident parents to grant access to non-resident parents are viewed as not mandatory because they're not. It's less than 1%, and that was before COVID, that were upheld when appeals were made because contact orders were not being abided by and contact was being denied, even though a judge had mandated that they should be. So, you know, that needs to happen, absolutely. But with regards to the maintenance orders, I think that the maintenance orders should not be enforced, they should be abolished. Yeah. 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 Mm. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. People should be entirely at liberty to make their own arrangements if they feel that it's appropriate for one person to attach themselves to someone else's property or earnings.
You know, the goalposts can move, can't they? You could be in a first-year when you join a school. One of you, male or female, has a hugely stellar career. The other one is the home husband or home wife. And then you decide to go your separate ways. How do you come to an equitable arrangement?
Yeah, but I mean, you know, if people are unable to make those agreements voluntarily and they're going to be upheld, it's kind of on them if their situation has changed and they feel like they shouldn't have done that. You know, but at the moment, you know, it's I don't actually know of the kind of progress that's being made, but I do know that courts have the right to go, oh, I don't think, you know, they were being sensible when they wrote that, so we're going to just ignore it. I know that's available, and that just shouldn't be available. As far as I'm concerned, if you sign your name, you are liable.
develop problems. So his wife basically so when the court do this thing, there's no difference before. He's in the same
Mm. Yeah.
Once, and even though the court will be
Yeah, and even if we do take the proposition that I reject, that money is absolutely integral to the prospects for children's outcomes, what good does it do to withhold all those thousands of pounds from his daughter? Because that's where they would have gone, right? They're going to go to a lawyer instead of him keeping them for her. Yeah. 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 I mean, it might be an idea to just entirely separate these two fields. We have, the economics dealt with by contract law, and we have the, as far as I'm concerned, children having access to their families, because it's not just non-resident parents, it's also the grandparents, very often the aunties and the uncles, should be regarded as a public health issue. Why is it being taken into courts where you've got a necessarily adversarial system? That seems very unwise. And actually, why bring money into it at all? Surely it would be a better idea to keep those as separate as we possibly can. Mm. Mm. 100%.
Consciously unconscious. They always say in the press releases that children's priority will be our main priority. Even though we cases yeah.
Yes. My understanding is that it's the Israelis who are treating this as a public health issue. Stuart Huntry has spoken to me about this during the ICMI, 2020, perhaps, possibly 2021. So that's on YouTube. But I had difficulty finding evidence for what's happened because it's all in Hebrew. But yeah, I mean, it just seems like a sort of no-brainer, really, because these are emotional issues. Mental health is fundamentally treated as a public health issue. When you look even at sort of addiction, to Class A drugs, treating them as public health issues are consistently more effective. So it is really, I think, a question of bringing expertise into mitigating conflict and aiming to find better outcomes rather than setting people against each other in these very delicate emotional situations.
bringing this in and making the wrong decision. So,
yeah. So I mean, the parental alienation is a very it's a bad time for parental alienation, because it's at a point where it's been recognized and we need to bring it to people's attention, and in bringing it to people's attention we actually are feeding malevolent people tips on how to cause damage, and that's a shame, but we don't have a choice. We have to bring it to attention in order to be able to solve the problem.
Are there any more questions? Thank you so much on our behalf. Oh, we have a question. Sorry.
Yeah, so I mean, was it just liberals and feminists you mentioned? Because I mean, liberals, I mean, I would classify myself as a classical liberal. You know, conservatism is a form of liberalism, and there's a conservative commentator from the US called Bill Whittle who said that conservatism is the conservation of liberal values. Like, you know, liberalism is just about people being treated as being individually valuable as human beings. So yeah, there's that. But if it, you know, obviously, I think you mean liberals, like left-leaning liberals, and I was radically left, to be fair, as a youngster, and my mother and father are both radically left. All of my family is left-wing to some extent. Because my family is from the north, that did mean they voted Brexit, so I don't know to what degree that disqualifies us in the current climate. But you know, I mean, my father is particularly good. Most of my family are particularly good. They're all left-wing, but they are perfectly able to have a rational conversation, and they're all old enough to have seen men in particular shafted by the system that we have, and their children suffering by not having access to their fathers repeatedly. They know that there are problems here, and I think that they would absolutely be keen to get behind any good ideas that could mitigate problems. Feminists, I have slightly less favourable opinion of them, although there are some. You know, Janet Street Porter in the article that I cited there was spot on. There are feminists who have an idea of feminism as being about men and women having equal rights and opportunities and choices. And the weird thing is that there are some, well, I don't know too much about her, to be honest. I couldn't really comment, but you know, there are some feminists like Camille Paglia and Wendy McElroy who are so incredibly intelligent and insightful that I just can't understand why they attach themselves to this label with so much baggage. But I do think that the majority of feminists, as compared to left-wingers, are more bogged down in misandry, and are more prejudiced. However, I mean, my real fear is that actually this issue, as well as the whole raft of issues, or a whole raft of issues that are facing our civilization, are not going to come down to whether the man and woman on the street are reasonable. It's actually about vested interests. And so I'm not sure whether we can make a difference right now. I actually think that the whole system might need to collapse and we might have to rebuild. But, you know, I still think that these conversations are going to be useful as long as all of the books are not burnt before people start on the reconstruction effort.
Any more questions? Ian?
100%. Yeah.
More and more people are aware of the situation. But if more people are aware, I feel that inevitably, hopefully, comes about.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah.
I think there is a general awareness.
Yeah. Yeah. Awareness is incredible. Like the way that people have taken to, you know, I mean, people will choose to watch 3 hours of Joe Rogan talking to some academic rather than 3 hours of the junk that they put out on mainstream TV. Like we are good. And even the surveys, you know, time after time, people are very sensible. And there are so many encouraging signs as regards what we want collectively. I think the question for me is just how, and actually, no, I do believe in the sort of just the general theory of the human sort of progress that like Steven Pinker puts forward, that, you know, it's not a linear path upwards. No. We have the bumps in the road, but we do progress. And I do think that we will be better off in 100 years. But I am concerned with how willing the powers that be are to try to hold on to power despite our wishes, because if they just refuse to give way, then everything will, you know, be incredibly chaotic, and there will be suffering, more suffering than necessary on the way to that progress.
Seems officially ended. I mean,